I'm going to surprise you a little bit in 804. I'm actually going to talk about a recent discussion about skin color. In that discussion, just let you know I'm going over these in detail. I'll get those grades posted. But if you're getting your these quality entries in, you're fine. Now, sorry, I'm a little delayed on that, but I think it's too important. Your discussion is so good. I took so many notes over the one that was due a week ago that I had to. I'm just going to go through a number of things. I feel like I'm going to have to post a few of the several of your discussions. Your entries were just wonderful, and some of the replies. Some things that really stuck to me. I'm trying to remember the one that there was a statement that I think Gail said this, but if I attribute it to the wrong person, it's still collective wisdom. Yes, Grace said, we are taught to hate, and that's really the bottom line. We're not born with race or skin color discrimination in our mindset. It's taught to children. They learn it when they're young, and we deal with it when we deal with kids coming and wherever they're from. They have certain preconceived beliefs. This is a belief. It's not a fact. They're taught, at least taught, to discriminate. And so how do we go about unteaching hate? That's pretty much sums it up there. And Becky Dunn, you made the statement that you'd ask two teachers about, we know that race is a false concept. There are no races. And you said the teachers are kind of stunned because people are so bought into the idea that there are certain races and certain continents, and this is the way it's always been, when in fact, all of this is nonsense. But it's so huge, and it colors everything in the way people think. Annika, you mentioned that a guy told you out in Colorado that certain group of people were genetically, they just were poor because it's genetic. And a person that probably thought he was making good sense and had thought this over made the most absurd statement that poverty is a genetic issue. We don't know how to manage money because we don't have the genes for managing money. That was real shocking. So those are some things that came to mind. And Lisa, you mentioned that you talk about cultural groups and you don't use the term race. And I agree. I tend to use that term. I'm going to think about what other term I could use rather than the word group. Another thing, Annika, you mentioned that there are jelly beans that do not taste like they look. And I was thinking, wouldn't that be interesting? I had never thought of that or seen something like that. You know, they make jelly beans that taste like all kinds of bad things. They're not bad for you. They don't have that in them. But they got one that tastes like vomit or something. You imagine if it looked all nice and strawberry and put it in your mouth and it tastes like nausea. Seeing is not believing. It's good, Taylor, you mentioned a lot of people come from the belief that we should accept all people and that we all, the idea that we all come from probably from a very tiny group of people. I don't know if it's one parent or three, but very few people at one time were literally the parents of the human race, except I got to take the word race out. So now it's just human. And that's something that you can confront people if they have a belief system that teaches against racism, but then they buy into it. You say, well, how does that come up? That's kind of confrontational, but, pointing out inconsistencies in human beings is not really a positive way to to enlighten them. They usually just get angry because it implies they're a hypocrite, which they are. Oh, just thought I'd mention this hat was signed by Buck O'Neill, and he was a famous guy in Kansas City who started the Negro Baseball Hall of Fame in Kansas City, if you've ever been there. And that's what it's called. It's right next to the Jazz Museum. And I met him a couple of times, and a friend of mine gave me this, and he autographed it. He passed away a few years ago. He didn't get in the Hall of Fame, but a whole bunch of other people did, and hopefully he'll get in the Hall of Fame soon. He was a wonderful man. He'd talk about, he'd always have time for people. He'd go to the baseball games and greet people and sign autographs. So it's really special, this hat. And I wear it. I know he didn't wear it, but he played for the Kansas City Monarchs. He was actually their manager. Okay, well, that's a little aside. You talked about films, and there's more than I can't say everything on this tape, but you don't want to watch that long. So, but I'm going to bring up some things I also saw. Films were brought up. Some of you thought you could, depending on the age group, obviously you couldn't use some of the tapes I shared with you with children, but you mentioned some others. I'm going to go through this. What is, I think Lisa or somebody mentioned, Remember the Titans. Okay, dealing with African-American white issues. It's good because it's got football and it's got the concept of team. Most people now agree that, you would look for where people compromise. Where did they come together and say, look, we used to have segregated armed forces that stopped right at the end of World War II. And that's something to look at. If you ever get a chance for a film, look up the Court Martial of Jackie Robinson. It's a film. And you can also look up the Jackie Robinson story. If anybody doesn't know, he's the first African-American to play professional baseball since Roscoe Barnes for the Cincinnati Redlegs in about 1872. So there was discrimination there. Okay, other movies. I'm going to try to look through these. I wrote some down. Maybe I didn't get them all down. Resources. I wrote down The Boy in the Striped Pajamas. That's not something you show children, but if you know what it is, it's a great movie. The Diary of Anne Frank, obviously. I like to sometimes get away from just highlighting the most obvious groups that we talk about in the United States, that we can see racism, discrimination in other cultures. It's not just a white versus non-white. It can be other variations in other cultures. And it can also be social status, terrible discrimination by social status, or by what the work people do. So those are other things. Those are a couple of movies that come to mind. Joanne, you mentioned there was a kid-friendly version of a skin color video that I showed, and I didn't get that down what that is, but I'll look that up. Cassie has a link. I'll put it on. I'm going to repeat that and put that on an email to everyone so you have access to that. Oh, Taylor, you had The Last Stop on Market Street, Taylor Jarman. That's in the book, I think, right? So those are some really good examples. I like Valeria, your own personal example of issues. A lot of stuff very current because you can talk to Latino students or students from other cultures. You're going to find discrimination. Asians, obviously, suffer a lot of discrimination. If you ever get a chance in Nebraska, if you're from Nebraska, there is a famous American airman on the Memphis, I think it's the Memphis Belle, but he was Japanese American. He's from Western Nebraska. I know people that knew him, and he was a bombardier. I think a bombardier over Germany. I think it was the Memphis Belle, which was the first plane to complete 25 missions, and then they were released from there. If you could fly 25 times over Germany on bombing missions and survive, then you were free. You didn't have to keep going forever bombing missions. Okay, so I looked those up. I want to find out where those number of books. Okay, Number of Stars by Lors Lowry. Kimberly brought that up. Remember the Titans, also a book, I'm sure. Through My Eyes by Ruby Bridges is a good one. I have that book here. Now, and Becky has red hair. I have to keep that. I know I have, if you could see it, you'd have to trust me, but I have red hair in my mustache, and if I have a beard. You see I have freckles. I'm just a kid. And I had ancestors with red hair, but when I had our first son, I grew a beard, and it was a bright red beard. Didn't match anything. I had to get rid of it. It was all ugly and curly. And my son now has kind of a reddish beard, my second son, and I've been playing with my grandson. It's always fun. And he has a kind of a reddish beard, but very distinguished. My beard was not, it was just, it looked like it just curled up and died in the middle of itself, like a dying field of hair. I thought it was interesting, Annika, you brought up about a genetic disease, which I didn't know. It was affected the nerves and caused people to lose control of their body over time. You said they traced it to a person who traveled from somewhere in the either Eastern Europe or the East, Far East, and he apparently shared his genes in Sweden and in Portugal, and there are two places where this gene appears, and it's from one man, apparently. So that was very interesting. You also mentioned you talked to Germans, and I had a little bit of experience with this. Germans do not like to talk about World War II. Anybody that was in World War II didn't talk about it. I had a Japanese friend many years ago. It was in Tokyo during World War II. She was 5 years old. Place was firebombed. She survived. It's just something they don't talk about. The Germans, obviously, well, I mean, war, anytime you're traumatized in war, it's terrible. I do want to share something with you that is a little bit off from this, but it's just very interesting. My son told me that there's been some research on LSD, and some of you know what that is, hallucinogenic drug. And there are some cases where LSD has cured PTSD, is it? Where when I say it's cured, people have taken a limited amount of LSD and it's gotten rid of their trauma from war or from some terrible experience. But scientifically, it doesn't work all the time, and there's no guarantees, so it's probably never going to be allowed. But it was ironic, and he couldn't tell me. He just knew from reading some of the research. His friend published it. This somehow does something to the synapse in the brain, and it affected areas that have been traumatized. Because when you have a traumatic experience, it's actually physically damages your nerve cells. Trauma is real, and it's a physical reality in the brain. Anyhow, I thought it was interesting. I hope they're able to come up with something. I don't think taking LSD is going to cure everybody, so they're not going to allow that. But it was interesting because I'd never thought about it. Most people use behavioral modification or hypnotism or something. But you can imagine if you could physically heal a body with something that's illegal. It's kind of ironic. It's kind of like medical marijuana, I guess. I just mentioned that because it was interesting. It came out in an article. Okay, so that's about all I have to say about this. I'm going to be talking about books and resources that will deal with racism. And what I'm going to be doing in this class, I'm going to go ahead and tell you now, is we're going to be reading in the Middle of Everywhere by Mary Pipher, Pipher, who's from Lincoln. Some of you have already read it. She wrote another book called The Reviving Ophelia, helping young girls, I assume with trauma, but adolescent young girls. Anyhow, she wrote this book, and it's about refugees and their trauma trying to adjust to life in Lincoln, Nebraska, and mostly in this state, but she's known nationwide. So that's her reading book. I'm going to be having you read that book. So as you're reading that book, I'm going to be peppering you with more resources and videos, but you'll write your discussions about Mary Pipher. You won't, you can always email me if you want more stuff or more ideas, and I will try to overwhelm you with as much as I can. So I just want to let you know while I'm thinking about it so I don't forget. I don't want to make another video because you'll be bored. I'm going to put up our assignment tomorrow on Monday. It's going to be start reading Mary Pipher. I don't know if that's in my book yet, in my syllabus, but I'm going to change it some because we've done enough reading and reacting. Now we get to read for pleasure, and I think you'll enjoy that book. It's a really good read. Anything else I wanted to mention on here? I'm just trying to make sure. Teaching about the Holocaust can be very difficult. I have a lot of stuff on the Holocaust. We have a Holocaust survivor and that's very rare now. He was here about 3 years ago and gave a presentation on the Holocaust, and it's very emotional. And one thing has struck me, I won't allude to anything now, but it had a list of how laws started changing so that people of Jewish backgrounds suddenly found themselves, they couldn't practice certain business. They couldn't be in certain businesses. Then they couldn't live in certain places. Then they couldn't get a driver's license. That's not the order. I think license came first. Then they couldn't marry certain people. It was just and you saw the Nuremberg laws. I shared some of those with you about who could marry who, and they have all these rules. And I want you to think about those if you ever see something like that, about suddenly people being cracked down on, and suddenly, oh, we don't want you here anymore. Oh, people are going to disappear. People are going to be arrested. We're going to change the rules. We're going to change all the laws. I'm going to blame you for all the trouble we've had because most of the crime must come from you. Okay, I'll let you draw your own conclusions. But that really affected me because we had a timeline. First they did this, then they did this, then they did this, then it was Jehovah's Witnesses, then it was probably Quakers if they had any. Anybody that was a conscientious objector, anybody that had a belief system that was not traditional, and then anybody that wouldn't swear allegiance to Adolf Hitler, which meant that Christians had to basically agree to participate and support Hitler, or else they would be in trouble. You weren't allowed to speak up. So there was this clamp down. You could just feel it squeezing down on society. If you notice any squeezing down, you know what to think and hopefully what to do. Some of these on the comments, I'm going to share these. Kimberly had a great one. Cassie had a really good one here talking about second graders. And Andy, enjoyed yours very much. And I may just cut these up and post them because I don't want to read them to you because I did that for one video and it gets too long. So I will post everything tomorrow. I'm going to try to get some more work done tonight. So this is only about this past discussion. And I've got another thing or two I'm doing on discussions, but I got to keep track. Some of you are in both classes, but I got a 826 and I got to keep it. That's about teaching ESL. This is about dealing with diversity, which is very similar in many ways. So thank you, and I will get off the air.